Julius Caesar set himself up as dictator. And in fact, he says set himself up as dictator for life. The power of the Senate was broken. The Roman Republic was no more. In 47, don't worry about today, he was declared dictator, and 3 years later he was made dictator for life. Well, he made several reforms. Julius Caesar was not just interested in politics or in conquest. He was also interested in astronomy and the arts, and he put forth a calendar called the Julian calendar, which was to last for almost 600 years. Now, the calendar we go by is the Gregorian calendar, named after Pope Gregory the Great, whom we'll talk about later. Pope Gregory was one of the bright lights of the Dark Ages. But the Julian calendar, it turned out, had a few problems that they didn't realize until later. You may wonder sometimes, why is there a leap year? Well, there's a leap year because it takes the year 365 and almost a fourth day. You know, it's 365, but not quite 6 hours, 5 hours and some 20 minutes to go around the sun. Well, these 5 hours might sound like a little bit, but over the course of 100 years, all right, to make a long story short, if it weren't for the leap years, we'd wind up celebrating Christmas in a hot part of summer. And we'd be freezing, hard freeze in July. And this is what the Julian calendar was to lead to. The idea of having a leap year is to keep the solstices and equinoxes occurring at the same time. Now, for instance, 2 days ago was an equinox, the fall equinox. We want to keep the fall equinox occurring as close as possible to September 21st, except you might have noticed, hey, the fall equinox did not occur on September 21st. It would have, except that the year 2000 was not a leap year. What years are leap years? I mean, the year 2000 was a leap year, that's right, the 2000. Now, what years are leap years? Well, every year equal to divisible 4 is a leap year, except for the years at the end of a century. So the year 1700, 1800, 1900 were not leap years. The year 2100, if any of you live that long, will not be a leap year. The year 2200 will not be a leap year. But if the year is divisible 400, like 2000, 2000 was a leap year. So for the next 100 years, the fall equinox will occur on September 22nd. Eventually it could swing back and the fall equinox will occur on September 21st. But now, again, if you didn't have that leap year in the calendar, every 100 years, your equinox would come 3 days off. That may not sound like a lot until you realize after 500 years, the equinox took 15 days off. Actually with 4 days a century. So every 500 years, your equinox would be 20 days off. And again, after about 1,000 years, your equinoxes would be 40 days off. And by now, we'd be celebrating Christmas in the heat of summer. So the idea behind the calendar, Julius Caesar made a better calendar than had existed before him, but it took mankind 500 years to realize, hey, his calendar is inadequate. So then they changed the calendar. So much for that, I may have gone into too much detail. Julius Caesar also studied the Great Pyramids of Egypt. He had a few problems. Now, something I have not mentioned before. Socrates was epileptic. This you don't find very many references to. So was Julius Caesar. Again, why is this important? Well, one thing it might show that an epileptic person can achieve highly. Now, so, by the way, was Alexander the Great. Alexander was epileptic, Julius Caesar, Socrates. Now, when Julius Caesar was a young man, he stood at the Roman Museum and stood in front of a statue of Alexander the Great. It was said he just broke down crying. The problem was, he said, maybe he said to Alexander's statue, when you were my age, you had conquered the whole world. And here I am, I'm as old as you were when you started, and I haven't conquered anything. He was very upset about it. But then he wound up receiving a command and went on to conquer Gaul. And this, of course, meant that with Pompey having conquered Spain, Rome now had most of the western, actually they had all of the western Mediterranean. This area here, and they were eventually to conquer Syria, and later Greece. They actually conquered Syria before they got most of Greece. No, back up. No, they did. They conquered Greece first. Then went on to conquer Syria. Now, Julius Caesar might also have been paranoid. I mean, I'm going into a little bit into his personal life, but I think it's important for you to know something about some of these people. It was said that when Cicero spoke, Cicero was one of the few great philosophers that Rome produced. When Cicero spoke in the Senate, Julius Caesar trembled. What was it about what Cicero said that scared the wits out of Julius Caesar? Cicero made a speech, several speeches, that private individuals should not have armies. Armies should only belong to the state. The army's loyalty should be to the citizen. Also, one man should not control the government. The government should be in charge of a group of people. And of course, here Julius Caesar had just taken over Rome, and it was said that he could listen to Cicero. Cicero was a wealthy man himself. He refused to have an army. Cicero said that the armies belong to the state and not to private individuals, and as a private person, I will not have an army. And Julius Caesar was somewhat terrified at what Cicero said. Now, folk, I think this is worth mentioning. I mean, no ordinary history book will mention it, but it has been noted that Julius Caesar got where he was to the top of it by, I'll tell you, by letting himself be used in a homosexual relationship with an older man who was in power. Now, in those days, for a man to be used as a woman was considered a really big disgrace. And yet, to get himself elevated, Julius Caesar allowed himself to be used as a woman in a sexual relationship. I don't want to elaborate on that further, but nevertheless, this was how politics was run at the time, and this was how a lot of men got forged ahead in our political life. Roman politics was dirty in more ways than one. It involved a whole lot of assassinations, and when they called it backstabbing, they didn't mean what we mean by backstabbing. They meant with a real dagger in a real back. It involved a whole lot of assassinations and a whole lot of using anything you could use, any means at all, to get ahead, to get power. Julius Caesar was not hesitant to do just that. Well, Caesar was planning a whole lot of new military adventures in the East. He was planning to conquer the East, and he was planning a whole lot of building adventures. Now, somehow, folk, your authors have left out what I'm about to tell you. That they used to have it in the book, but the Ides of March are only remembered because Julius Caesar died on that date. The Ides of March is another name for the 15th of March. You know, the midpoint of the month of March. Now, according to the story, at the end, that used to be in the older textbooks, if you ever have an older textbook, Julius Caesar went to the Senate one day as usual. Several days, it was in late February, early March, and a blind soothsayer, in other words, a blind magician, met him, a blind beggar, And this blind beggar said to him, "You're going to die on the Ides of March." Julius Caesar shrugged it off. What Julius Caesar did not know was that about 20-some men were planning his death. And they all got together and said, "What we'll do is we'll go to the Senate on the Ides of March, and every one of us will put a dagger under his cloak," and from that comes the expression cloak and dagger. We'll all put a dagger in his cloak, and then we're going to position ourselves. Now, whichever way he's facing, they decided, you, about 5 or 6 men, you be in front of him, facing him. And then they said to 5 or 6 more, to you, whoever you get behind him, and then you get on his right hand, and you get on his left, and they were going to surround. But they're going to do it very casual-like. They'd be engaging in a conversation, not necessarily even in a conversation with their own group, but even in a conversation with anybody they could, and just casually talk while the men positioned themselves. And on a certain signal by one of the leaders, they were all to pull their daggers out of their cloaks and lunge at it. Well, anyway, Julius Caesar went to the Senate chamber on the morning of the Ides of March, and he passed by the blind soothsayer and he laughed. Hey, it's the Ides of March and I'm alive." The soothsayer said, "The Ides of March are not over with yet." He went into the Senate chamber, and the assassins began to casually position themselves. When they heard the right words spoken by the leader of the group, every one of them reached under his cloak and pulled out a dagger. And nobody else in the Senate chamber was armed except for the 20-some assassins. Julius Caesar tried to defend himself, but his friends could do nothing to help him. None of them were armed, and if his friend was, they would probably survive if they just simply let matters stand, left him alone. Julius Caesar looked around and saw what he thought was his friend Brutus, and his last words were "Et tu, Brute," which is Latin for "You too, Brutus." He was stabbed some 40 times and killed. His stabbing led to a power struggle. Now, during his lifetime, as I mentioned, Julius Caesar had married Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a woman, but nevertheless she had risen to the position of ruler of Egypt. Now, in the ancient world, there are very few women named, very few outstanding women. But I've had many a female student in my class do a paper on Cleopatra. She's one of the outstanding women at the time. And of course, when I was a teenager, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton and a whole bunch of famous actors and actresses went into the desert and made a movie called Cleopatra. The props for that movie were never moved. They're still in the desert. And in a dry desert, they might last for a long time. Why were they not moved? It would just be too expensive to move them. Cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the props were still there, but they made a movie of it. Have any of you seen the movie by any chance? I've once had a copy of it, but the copy I think faded by now. But I watched it. Yeah. Anyway, Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra, and I believe. Hi.